guns, more guns per capita than any industrialized nation in the world, as you can see from this graphic. And despite that, the town of Kennesaw, Georgia, population 21,000, passed a city ordinance that, get ready for this, it requires every household to have a gun and ammunition. Gun rights advocates want teachers to be armed in classrooms throughout the country.
Letting people in.
And just a few weeks ago, the Supreme Court expanded gun rights by striking down a New York state law that limited the right to carry a concealed weapon. Yet at the same time, Congress just passed the first gun control legislation in a generation. It's a very modest one, focusing on funding mental health and background checks for those under 21. But it seems as if the Supreme Court is going in one direction and Congress going in the opposite direction when it comes to the issue of gun rights versus gun control. So this debate over the right to bear arms is certainly one of the most contentious issues in recent American history. But that debate is filled with misconceptions and misunderstandings by people on all sides of the controversy. The right to bear arms, on the one hand, and the right of the government to control firearms, on the other hand, these are not mutually exclusive propositions. In fact, the United States, throughout its history, has always had both the right to bear arms and the right of the government to control firearms. Now, early Americans denied the right of gun ownership even to law-abiding people if they were on the wrong side of the American Revolution. And so when public necessity demanded it, the founding fathers were willing to seize guns from law-abiding citizens if they supported the British in the Revolutionary War. So gun control is as old as the country itself. Today, the debate is usually portrayed as a cultural battle between rural versus urban, with rural areas regarding guns as part of their cultural heritage of hunting. But in fact, urban gun owners represent a powerful voice in today's gun rights movement. They argue that firearms are a last line of defense against criminals. And so today, self-defense, not hunting, is at the core of the argument to the right to bear arms. 32% of American families own firearms, and there are some 400 million guns in America. That is more guns than people, as you can see from this chart. Many Americans are inspired by the folklore of the frontier, and others are ideologically disposed to the ideal of personal liberty to defend their right to own guns. So, should civilian possession of handguns and other non-hunting guns be banned or severely restricted? In answering that question, both sides defend their position based on the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment to the Constitution was adopted in 1791. And so let's take a close look at exactly what the Second Amendment says. It really is a very poorly worded sentence. It says, a well-regulated militia, being necessary for the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's the entirety of the Second Amendment. But it's really maddeningly ambiguous. Those who support gun rights emphasize only the second part of the Second Amendment, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Whereas gun control advocates maintain that the Second Amendment is all about the first clause, a well-regulated militia, and that the only right inherent in the Second Amendment is the right of a state to have an armed militia. Now, when we talk about a militia, today, the definition of a militia is all able-bodied males at least 17 years of age and under 45 years of age. That is the current US Code definition of a militia. So if the Second Amendment talks about a well-armed militia, does that mean that anyone older than 45 does not have the right to own guns under the Second Amendment? I think you could certainly make an argument for that. But regardless of the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms is a long-standing, well-established right in American law. 43 of the 50 state constitutions today contain language that protects the rights of individuals to own guns. So the debate today really goes beyond whether citizens have the right to bear arms. The current controversy is over whether the government has the right to regulate who should be armed, whether guns should be allowed to be carried outside the home, whether carrying guns outside the home, they should be concealed or not, and what type of firearms should the government declare legal. So this lecture will examine how the debate between gun rights versus gun control is deeply rooted in American history. So let us begin with the Revolutionary era. In the 1770s, the British Crown wanted to disarm political opponents in the American colonies. So in 1774, King George III ordered the cessation of all exports of firearms and ammunition to the colonies. And then the next year, in 1775, he ordered British commanders to disarm certain provinces in the colonies, particularly in the north. So as tensions were building up between the colonies and Great Britain, in the early 1770s, the British tried to disarm colonists. They conducted arbitrary searches of ships and wagons to find firearms. Complete disarmament of the colonists appeared inevitable. Now, at this time, the American colonists had no standing army of their own, but for decades they had formed militias composed of ordinary citizens to fight Native Americans at that time. Now, these militias relied on privately owned guns of men who were called to serve in these militias, those between the ages of 17 and 45. And it called for stockpiling guns and gunpowder for use in times of need. And so the British began seizing those stockpiles in order to make it harder for the colonists to rebel. When the British learned that the rebels were secretly stockpiling guns and ammunition in an arsenal in Concord, Massachusetts, British General Thomas Gage sent 700 troops to seize those weapons. And in response, Paul Revere and a few others set out on their famous midnight ride to warn people of the countryside that the British were coming and that the reason they were coming was to take away the guns of the colonists. And so the shots that were fired at Lexington and Concord on the morning of April 19th, 1775, that was a war that was ignited by a government effort to seize the people's firearms. So this issue of gun rights versus gun control is really as old as the country itself. In fact, the founding fathers were very fond of owning guns. George Washington owned 50 of them. Thomas Jefferson received his first firearm at the age of 10, and his papers are filled with notations about guns. So, for example, he wrote, "Let your gun be the constant companion on your walks." And then he added, "Never think of taking a book with you, but certainly take a gun." Now, while the founders loved their guns, they were also advocates of gun control. And the founding generation had many different forms of gun control. They may not have referred to it as gun control, but they understood that gun rights had to be balanced with the need for public safety. And so the founding fathers supported laws that forcibly disarmed slaves, that disarmed free blacks and people of mixed race out of fear that those groups might use guns to revolt against slave masters. So that was one form of gun control. It certainly was a racist motive, but it was a form of gun control. But some white people also were targets of gun control. Before the Revolution, at least one colony, Maryland, passed a law barring Catholics from possessing firearms. People who didn't support the revolution, as I mentioned, were ordered to turn over their weapons. It's estimated that 40% of the white population was loyal to the British during the American Revolution. So if you add that 40% to the slaves and free blacks who were not allowed to own guns, then you would have to conclude that a majority of the people at the time of the American Revolution were not allowed to own firearms. And there were other types of gun control in the Revolutionary era. So, for example, there were laws that required gunpowder to be stored on the top floor of buildings so that if they were to ignite, it would only damage the roof. If gunpowder were to be stored on the first floor of buildings, then that would destroy the building. Safe storage of arms was imposed on slave owners. They were required to keep their firearms locked up to ensure that slaves couldn't get hold of them. In Boston, city leaders determined that the combustibility of gunpowder posed such a danger that all loaded firearms had to be kept out of buildings. So if we look at this, we could see that there were a considerable number of laws controlling firearms. Yet there is no record of anyone complaining that these laws infringed upon the people's right to keep and bear arms. The basic idea that gun possession must be balanced with gun safety laws was an idea that the founders endorsed. The idea that the people had a right to keep and bear arms and that the government had the right to regulate such weapons, all of that was seen as consistent with the Second Amendment. Following independence, all Americans believed that ordinary citizens should have the right to possess guns. The framers of the Constitution were afraid that a standing army might be potentially used to suppress the people. And so the framers preferred America's army to be made up of common people, ordinary citizens who could be organized into local militias to fight off enemies when necessary. just as the revolutionaries did in the 1770s. And because there was no formal standing army, the founders required all free men between the ages of 18 and 45 to outfit themselves with a musket, a rifle, or some firearm suitable for military service. Now, government officials would inspect these weapons and account for firearms on public rolls. That was an early version of gun registration. The Second Amendment was included in the Bill of Rights in 1791 in order to reassure worried Americans that Congress would not have the power to destroy state militias by disarming the people. For most of American history, the federal courts said that the Second Amendment protected only the right of states to form militias, like the National Guard, that the Second Amendment did not protect the right of ordinary people to own firearms. In what became known as the militia theory of the Second Amendment, the courts maintained that the amendment gave militias the right to bear arms, but it said nothing about an individual having the right to bear arms. And over time, state militias eventually became less relevant as a means of national defense. And so too, the Second Amendment became less relevant. It wasn't until the 20th century that gun rights advocates argued that the Second Amendment legalized private gun ownership. Now, in the 19th century, the US government began to rely on a regular standing army rather than state militias. And so the traditional militia justification for the right to bear arms was increasingly replaced by the idea that the right to bear arms was primarily for personal defense against criminal attack. Early on, the issue of gun control was very much tied in with white supremacy in the United States. Many white Southerners were terrified at the prospect of Black men with guns, and so slaves were barred from possessing firearms. And some Southern states had laws forbidding slaves from even carrying a cane or a stick in public. Even free Blacks were prohibited from possessing any type of firearms. In the Civil War, some Blacks fought for the Union Army, and they were allowed to take home their muskets for a reasonable price. After the war, freed Southern Blacks were considered citizens, and therefore they had the right to be armed. And that led some whites, including those in the Ku Klux Klan, to seize every gun owned by Blacks. Even after losing the Civil War, Southern whites were determined to make sure that Blacks were disarmed and that they would be returned to their powerless condition. Now, we know that guns were widespread on the Western frontier, but you may not know that so was gun regulation widespread on the frontier. Almost everyone carried firearms in the untamed wilderness, but in frontier towns, the law often forbade people from toting their guns around. So here is a sign on a store in Main Street, Dodge City, 1878. The carrying of firearms is strictly forbidden. New arrivals were required to turn in their guns to authorities. In exchange, they would get something like a metal token. And when they wanted to leave the town, they then turned the token in and they got their guns back. So a visitor arriving in Wichita, Kansas in 1873 would have seen signs declaring, quote, "Leave your revolvers at police headquarters and get a check." Dodge City, you can see, featured this huge wooden billboard. And visitors were welcome, but their guns were not. If a cowboy wanted to have his guns on him, it would have to be out in the wilderness, not in frontier towns. If he wanted to drink some whiskey and play some poker at the saloon, he had to check his guns first. No gun control law was more common in the late 1800s than prohibitions on concealed firearms. The first ban on possessing a concealed weapon in public was adopted by Kentucky and then by Louisiana in 1813. Indiana passed a similar law in 1820, Tennessee and Virginia, 1838, Alabama in 1839, and Ohio in 1859. So these were state laws that banned the possession of concealed weapons. Those laws did not spark any controversy whatsoever, because few people thought that arming oneself was legal, much less constitutional. So you may be surprised to know that it was the South that led the nation in the development of gun control laws in the 19th century. And those laws applied equally to everyone, regardless of color. They were designed to diminish gunfights, to diminish dueling, which had been part of the Southern culture that dictated that if someone insulted you in public, you would challenge them to a duel. But Southern governments wanted to eliminate that. And so they increasingly passed stringent laws regulating the concealed carrying of deadly weapons. By the end of the 1800s, Texas, Florida, and Oklahoma restricted or banned the open carrying of guns. Bans on concealed carry spread to the frontier in 1887, when Montana banned the concealed carry of any deadly weapon within city limits, including pistols, daggers, slingshots, and brass knuckles. So, although the pro-gun lobby today often insists that gun control was first enacted in the 20th century, in reality, that kind of law was well established by the 19th century. Now let's take a look at gun control in the 20th century. It's amazing to think that it was not until the 1930s that the federal government first involved itself seriously in the business of regulating guns. That's the federal government. Up until that time, laws that banned concealed carry of firearms were passed by local or state government, not by the federal government. The dominant view was that crime was a state or local problem. Therefore, crimes did not come under federal jurisdiction. But the enactment of prohibition during the 1920s led to a crime wave throughout the nation. The weapon of choice during prohibition was the Tommy gun, and that made gangsters of the prohibition era radically more violent than earlier criminals. A famous and widely publicized case where fully automatic weapons was used in crime in the United States was in the winter of 1929. It was called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Newspapers and radio heightened the public's distress over gun violence. Local law enforcement, meanwhile, was increasingly shown to be ineffective in combating the modern-day outlaw armed with automatic weapons. And so criminals like Al Capone, Bonnie and Clyde, and John Dillinger led many to believe that the time had come to enlist the help of the federal government to fight desperados and their guns. Before this time, because policing was a state function, federal agents did not have the power to arrest people, and they were not allowed to even carry guns. It wasn't until the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt that new agents added to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they were known at that time as G-men, that it was not until the 1930s that they were permitted to carry weapons, including submachine guns. Strong laws were necessary to restrict the most dangerous weapons from the public. And so Congress adopted the first gun control law in 1934. It was called the National Firearms Act, and it imposed an onerous tax on machine guns and on sawed-off shotguns and on rifles. Every time one of those weapons was manufactured, sold, or transferred, the federal government imposed a $200 tax on the transaction. Now, that would be about $2,500 in today's dollars. And as a result, legitimate sales of those guns dried up immediately. The National Firearms Act also required that owners of machine guns and sawed-off shotguns had to register with federal authorities and submit to fingerprinting within 60 days. Now, mobsters and desperados certainly were able to afford the $200 tax, but they wouldn't want to register and get fingerprinted. So that was a very effective way to limit access to shotguns and rifles. The first major federal gun control law was deemed so successful that 4 years later, Congress again asserted its authority over guns by passing the Federal Firearms Act of 1938, which barred felons from receiving firearms. State or local governments also turned their attention to gun control. They directed their efforts particularly towards handguns. And so in 1911, New York State adopted one of the strictest gun control laws in the nation. It was called the Sullivan Dangerous Weapons Act. And that required anyone who wanted to possess a handgun to first obtain a permit. And it was that 1911 law that the Supreme Court just declared unconstitutional in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. And so that very strict New York State gun control law is now taken off the books. We will return to that decision later in this presentation. But going back to the 1920s, numerous states, including California, adopted what were known as revolver acts, requiring civilians to obtain a permit to carry a concealed weapon, and gun dealers would have to deliver to police detailed records of all handgun sales. And because guns were easily transported across state lines, many other states adopted similar revolver laws. Now, it's amazing that the National Rifle Association, the NRA, which was formed in 1871, actually supported these restrictive gun laws in the early 20th century. The assassination of John Kennedy, who was killed by a mail-order gun, inspired Congress to pass the Gun Control Act of 1968. The subsequent assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy fueled the quick passage of this law. The key element of this bill outlawed mail-order sales of rifles and shotguns, and it expanded licensing and record-keeping requirements. It also prohibited felons and mentally ill people from buying guns. And it prohibited the importation of these small, cheap handguns known as Saturday night specials. Now, this law was ambiguous about exactly who was required to have a license. The law referred to people who were, quote, engaged in the business of dealing firearms, but it didn't provide any details about how to define those terms. Was it selling 50 guns a year that meant that you would come under this restriction, or 10 guns, or 5? The law did not specify. Then in 1972, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was created to oversee the regulation of gun sales. Today, the NRA is opposed to any restriction on firearms. Yet, For most of its history, the National Rifle Association supported extensive gun control laws. It wasn't until the 1970s, that is 100 years after the NRA was established, that it became committed to a more extreme view of gun rights that we know today. And if it hadn't have been for the Black Panthers, who emerged in the 1960s, there might never have been a modern gun rights movement. So, guns became part of the official uniform of the Black Panthers. They wore black berets, black leather jackets, a powdered blue shirt, and they always carried firearms. In the 1960s, California law allowed people to carry guns in public as long as those guns were visible, as long as they were not concealed. You needed a license only if you wanted to carry a concealed firearm. And so anyone was allowed to carry a handgun posted on the outside of their clothing. Anyone was allowed to walk around with a rifle or shotgun in public so long as it wasn't carried in a threatening manner. So the Panthers carried their guns in public, openly displaying them for everyone. They particularly wanted the police to see their guns because their implied message was, if the police attack Black people, then the Panthers would attack back. Then the Panthers took their guns to the state capitol in Sacramento in May of 1967, and it made headlines across the country. Horrified whites began to call for the government to take more aggressive action to stop the Panthers. And less than 3 months after the Panthers visited Sacramento, then Governor Ronald Reagan signed a law that prohibited anyone but police from bringing a loaded firearm to the state capitol. And from that moment on, anyone caught carrying a loaded gun on a public street in California would face 5 years in prison. That law was called the Mulford Act. Reagan said, there is no reason why on the street today a citizen should be carrying loaded weapons. Now, let's think about that. This is Ronald Reagan, a president who was very conservative, who gun rights people would admire, would look up to. But he said, because the Panthers had carried guns in public, President Reagan said there's no reason why on the street today a citizen should be carrying a loaded weapon. And then Congress passed the Mulford Act, which prohibited the public carrying of loaded firearms anywhere. It was the strictest gun control law of the late 1960s. And it was at that point that the NRA began to oppose the very idea of gun control. So ironically, the NRA began to echo many of the principles that the Black Panthers were espousing. Like the Panthers, the NRA argued that guns were necessary for personal defense. Both the Panthers and the NRA demonized law enforcement as the enemy, which wanted to take guns away from law-abiding citizens. But whereas the Black Panthers went to Sacramento to make their voices heard, the NRA went to Washington and hired lobbyists. And encouraged by the NRA, a number of states began to add explicit guarantees for the right to bear arms in their state constitutions. And so, if we look at this list in the 1980s and 1990s, these states all included in their constitutions the right to bear arms, which is exactly contradictory to what President Reagan, then Governor Reagan, was saying, that no one should have the right to carry arms in public. Prompted by complaints that the federal government had been abusing its power to enforce gun laws, Congress passed the Firearms Owners Protection Act of 1986. So this was a law that protected gun ownership. It authorized the sale of guns between private owners, reflecting a growing influence of the NRA and a strongly pro-gun Reagan administration. The law limited the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms from inspecting gun dealers more than once a year. The law specifically forbade the government from creating a national registry of gun ownership. And so this law tried to undermine those previous gun control laws passed earlier in the 20th century. In the 1980s, new organizations arose that were even more opposed to gun control than the NRA, such as the Gun Owners of America and the Michigan Militia. This radical wing of the gun rights movement focuses on the value of guns in fighting tyranny. They argue that guns are the last line of defense against our government, which they claim is determined to deprive Americans of their rights. They were tied to the militia movement and its conspiratorial theory that the United Nations was coming in black helicopters to take away guns from lawful American citizens. You may remember what happened at Ruby Ridge and Waco, Texas, when federal authorities fired on right-wing extremist groups, and that supplied kindling for the early militia movement. And that movement exploded after November 1993, when, under a Democratic administration, Congress passed the Brady Bill, named for the press secretary who was disabled by the attempted assassination on President Reagan in 1981. It was called the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, that required gun dealers, not private sellers, but gun dealers, to run background checks on purchases, and it authorized the creation of a national database. So this 1993 law contradicted the 1986 law. But in 1997, the Supreme Court ruled that the provision of the Brady Act that compelled state and local law enforcement to perform background checks, that violated state sovereignty as guaranteed under the 10th Amendment. Until a few weeks ago, the last significant federal gun law was in 1994. It was called the Assault Weapons Ban. This was the last significant federal gun law until the gun law that was passed a few weeks ago. This 1994 weapons ban banned the sale of these new assault weapons, these AR-15s, for 10 years. And it banned large capacity ammunition magazines, limiting them to just 10 rounds. But the law had in it a sunset provision that allowed the law to expire in 2004. And that is exactly what happened. And the law was never renewed. Now, since the lapse of this law, there has been a dramatic increase in mass shootings, many by assault weapons that were banned under the 1994 assault weapons ban. So, does the Constitution protect the right of citizens to bear arms? As we have seen, local, state, and federal government passed numerous laws to restrict the right to bear arms. From 1791 until 2008, the Supreme Court never once declared unconstitutional any law violating the Second Amendment. Let me repeat that. From 1791, when the Second Amendment was written, until 2008, that is just, 14 years ago, the Supreme Court never once declared any law violating the Second Amendment as unconstitutional. In the handful of cases involving gun rights, the courts declared that the Second Amendment addressed only the right to have guns for serving in a militia. And that's the way it was until 2008. But all that changed in a decision known as District of Columbia versus Heller, when the Supreme Court declared that the Second Amendment protects the right of an individual to keep a loaded gun at home for self-defense. This was a law that struck down a very strict gun control law in Washington, D.C. It was a 5-4 decision. It was authored by the late Justice Antonin Scalia. So this was the first time that the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment's right to bear arms protects an individual's right rather than one related to an organized state militia, as had been the legal understanding for decades before. But it's important to note that Scalia also pointed out that the right of an individual to own a gun under the Second Amendment was not unlimited. He said, like most rights, the Second Amendment right is not unlimited. It is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, and for whatever purpose. So what Scalia is saying is that individuals have the right to own firearms, but that the government has the right to regulate where these weapons could be carried and in what manner and for what purpose. And so the 2008 landmark decision in the Heller case, that seemed to answer the question whether individuals had the right to own guns. But it didn't resolve questions concerning background checks or the type of firearms someone could possess. Then came the 2012 Newtown massacre, when 20 elementary school children and 6 adults were killed by a 20-year-old armed with an AR-15 style semi-automatic assault rifle. There was an immediate demand for background checks on sales of such weapons after the Newtown shootings. Americans supported universal background checks by a margin of 91% to 8%. A majority of gun owners supported universal background checks. In fact, 88% of gun owners supported background checks. But the NRA, which in the past had supported background checks, now opposed it. So think about this. In 1999, Wayne LaPierre, the president of the NRA, said, "We think it's reasonable to provide mandatory instant background checks for every sale at every gun show. No loopholes anywhere for anyone." This is what he said in 1999. But after the Newtown shooting, the NRA was afraid that there would be a movement to restrict the manufacture and sale of guns. And so the NRA, after the Newtown shooting, came out against background checks. And despite mass murders after Newtown, most recently in Buffalo, Uvalde, and in Chicago, Congress declined to pass any gun control legislation at all, at least until a few weeks ago. Proposals such as barring people on terrorist watch lists from buying guns, those proposals were defeated. Imagine that. If you're on a terrorist watch list, you could still legally purchase a gun. Extending background checks to firearms purchased online, that passed in the Senate, but it failed in the House of Representatives during the Trump administration. So you can buy any weapon online without a background check. In 2017, then President Trump signed a bill into law that reversed an Obama-era regulation that made it harder for people with mental illness to buy a gun. So Trump signed a law that made it easy for people who are mentally ill to buy a gun. And yet, when we get mass shootings, the NRA claims that we should focus not on guns, but on mental illness. Yet, President Trump signed a bill to make it easier for people with mental illness to buy a gun. And Congress showed no inclination whatsoever to revive that 1994 assault weapons ban, which would make AR-15s and similar automatic weapons illegal. Proponents of gun reform in this country must not just have to overcome a powerful gun lobby. They're also up against our most durable myth, the notion that a man with a gun is a force powerful enough to defend against any danger. That's part of our national identity. And for better or worse, guns have become America's most potent symbol of masculinity and power. Our national mythology reinforces the importance of guns. That since 1776, our personal freedom depends on an armed citizenry standing up to a government that is threatening to take away our liberty. That's all part of our national mythology. So let's now turn to the gun law that was passed just last month. It's called the 2022 Gun Control Law. What this law does is it enhances background checks, but only for potential gun buyers under the age of 21. It provides millions of dollars for states to implement so-called red flag laws that allow officials to temporarily confiscate guns from people who are deemed in court to be too dangerous to own firearms. The law pours more federal money into shoring up mental health programs across the country and money for toughening security in schools. And finally, the bill tightens a federal ban on domestic abusers from buying firearms. So while this law represents the most substantial gun safety legislation in decades, it doesn't include more sweeping measures to impose universal background checks or to ban the sale of large capacity magazines. It doesn't close the loophole of gun purchases which occur through private sales at gun shows, at flea markets, through classified advertisements or among friends. Republicans also said they refuse to consider any mandatory waiting period for gun sales or a license requirement to purchase an assault weapon. So, in conclusion, it's really unrealistic to think that guns can be eliminated in the United States. Firearms are far too embedded in the history, values, and culture of this country. Nevertheless, some gun rights supporters, including the NRA, take positions that are dangerous and threatening to every citizen. Gun owners do not need armor-piercing bullets for self-defense or to hunt animals. There's no need for having a magazine with 50 rounds of ammunition so that you don't have to reload. An individual does not need an AK-47 to protect his or her home. NRA opposition to a national database of gun owners, because it will enable the government to confiscate all guns, that's based purely on paranoia. And the gun lobby's opposition to a waiting period for firearm purchases is, in my mind, just indefensible. Supporters of gun rights argue that if you make guns illegal, then only criminals will have guns. But the regulation of the sale and purchase of guns would reduce the number of illegal firearms on the street. If law enforcement was able to track and regulate the flow of firearms from manufacture to sale, it would certainly make a dent in the number of weapons that ultimately wind up in the hands of criminals. Now, originalists on the current Supreme Court argue that any interpretation of the Constitution should be based on what the framers of the Constitution intended and should be based on history. They say that the Constitution should be understood as it was at the time it was written. But the implication of the Second Amendment today is vastly different than when the amendment was written in 1791, as illustrated by this cartoon. In addition, the originalists ignore the long history of government regulation of concealed weapons, as I've tried to illustrate in this presentation, that ever since the birth of this nation, the government has regulated the ownership of weapons. The recent Supreme Court decision striking down the New York state law against concealed carry, that represents a dramatic expansion of gun rights at a time when gun violence is becoming epidemic. As UC Berkeley law professor Erwin Chemerinsky points out, no right embodied in the Constitution is absolute. And of course, Justice Scalia would agree with that. Rights must be balanced by the compelling need of the state to protect public safety. So, for example, government can limit freedom of speech or the right to privacy if those rights endanger the public at large. It would appear to any reasonable person that it is in the public's compelling interest to regulate concealed weapons and to ban firearms originally intended for war rather than for hunting or self-defense. Firearms like AR-15s. Now, that is not a radical step. Those weapons were banned in 1994. Unfortunately, that law expired 10 years later. But government regulation, as I've tried to illustrate, regulation of firearms is as old as the country itself. And we can only hope that saner provisions will prevail. After each mass shooting, there's a call for Congress to do something, and Congress never does. And so it's very hard to be optimistic about stricter gun control laws in this country. We can hope, but so far, that has not produced any significant result, certainly not since the 1994 Brady bill. So I wish I could leave you with a more optimistic note, but that is my take on the history of gun control in America. So at this time,